Hey, I'm Osman Faruqi, and this is The Drop, a culture show from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, where we dive into the latest in the world of pop culture and entertainment. I'm here with Mel Kembry.
Hello.
Thomas Mel, as you know, is out of action this week. He's away. He's in a remote location on the set of an exciting upcoming movie that we'll get to hear about down the track, but it's just you and I holding it down together. How you doing? How you feeling about that?
I'm doing good. I believe yesterday he gave me an update. He said he was going to be swimming with crocodiles, which I thought didn't sound safe.
He texted me that as well. We're sort of probably giving away the location he is at by saying that. And I don't know if he meant, because then we got a video from him this morning where he had, you know, when you go on those trips on a boat and they put the meat on a stick. I don't think he's getting in that river, is he? He's not swimming with the crocodile.
I had questions. I said, are you confused? Do you mean you're going swimming with dolphins? But he seemed adamant that he was going to be with the crocodiles.
Well, then this might be, we might never have him back on the podcast. This could be the future of the podcast after Thomas is eaten by a croc.
But what a way to go. If anyone's going to go out in such a big way, it's going to be Thomas Mitchell.
You were telling me just before we started recording that you're a big fan of a surprising show you've been watching. No one that I would have expected from you. Jeremy Clarkson's latest series, Clarkson's Farm. You just love the fact that he's striking a blow against woke culture?
Look, I have to, and I caveat this with, I don't read his column. I didn't watch Top Gear. I'm not super across Jeremy Clarkson public phenomenon. I've just come to him really in this show, and I've always liked shows about farming. Like I like River Cottage as well, and all it is watching a man who can't farm try to farm, and I actually think it's doing quite good public service. Like, it is shining a light on the plight of farmers and how difficult an industry it is and the importance of it, and I think he actually comes across quite well. And I mean, I guess if you're kind of more aware of his persona beyond the farm, it might be harder to like him, but I find him quite charismatic and fun to watch. And it's actually all the supporting cast in it as well is really good. All the locals who feature. Do you watch it?
No, I've never seen it, but I do hear people of all kinds of backgrounds and views enjoy this show. I'm kind of willing to take your word for it. I did like Top Gear. Like, my dad loved Top Gear, so we watched a lot of Top Gear when I was growing up, and I always found him, you know, a little bit like acerbic and a bit annoying, but he's pretty good like TV presence. And I just don't read his columns in, you know, the Times or the Daily Mail, wherever he writes, where he just sort of has a go at issues of the day. So yeah, if I can just like put that to the side and just watch this man, as you say, what is he farming? Is this like a hobby farm, or is this like a large scale agricultural, you know, project?
Yeah, large-scale agricultural.
Oh, really?
Project.
It's like a big farm he's doing.
Yeah. There are all kinds of crops. They're having problems with their rape seeds. Don't plant those. Very temperamental. Barley, wheat. They've got pigs. I've learned so much about pigs' gestations and pregnancies. I feel like a farmer myself now. So it's all kinds of things. He's growing mushrooms.
Should we just scrap the pod and just talk about this and what you've learned from farming?
Yeah. I think that's it. I know how to make cider, how you have to make sure you ferment it well so the bottles don't explode. I mean, there's a lot to take away from it.
There's another thing I need to ask you about. I hear a rumor, Mel, that you're now maybe like one step removed from the biggest pop star in the history of the world, Taylor Swift. Is that true?
Yeah, I think that is fair to say that I might be name checked in some of her songs in the future. No, I interviewed Miranda July, who's an artist and author. Do you know much about her?
I am familiar with some of the things she's directed, but I'm like probably not, you know, as deep in the Miranda July universe as others.
Yeah, I reckon this book, her new one, it's called All Fours, is going to be a huge hit. That's why I was interviewing her. I'd only read her book, The First Bad Man. That's how I came to her. I read that a while ago. And then I went back and watched the films, Kajillionaire, Me and You and Everyone We Know, which was quite a big hit, her debut. So I was talking to her for this book. Turns out she's really good friends with Margaret Qualley, who is the wife of Jack Antonoff, who is, as we know, the super producer of Taylor, and they've had lots of brushes together, and Miranda July is kind of part of their circle, and went to Jack Antonoff and Margaret's wedding and said that Taylor Swift kind of ruined it with all the publicity that came along with that.
Well, that gives us, firstly, very cool that you interviewed Miranda July. That's exciting. Secondly, that gives us another thing we have in common, because I also know someone who attended that wedding and is friends with Margaret Qualley. So there you go. Basically, the two
Wow.
of us should have been there.
Who do you know?
Geraldine Viswanathan, who's an Australian
Yes.
actress who was most recently in Drive Away Dolls, the Ethan Coen film, alongside Michael Collins. She also was at that wedding. And she told me a really funny story about Taylor Swift, kind of recognizing her and them having conversation about Taylor Swift's handbag. And I really tried to get her on the pod to talk about Drive Away Dolls and get her to tell us that story. And just the timings didn't work out because she was in LA. And then she went on like Kimmel and told that story on Kimmel. And I'm like, damn, that's a story worthy of American late night TV. And we could have had it on this pod first. Damn.
She road tested you first. I actually had a bit of confusion with Miranda July about the wedding because I said to her, I didn't see you there. And I meant I didn't see you in the paparazzi pictures. But I think she thought I was also potentially there. And I was trying to say, like, I was there, but I didn't see you there. So I had
did
to
she
clarify.
say, like, what were you doing there? How did you get there?
No, I think, well, then she thought maybe I was questioning the veracity of her account because she was like, no, I was there. I guess I just
she thought
wasn't
you
in
were saying you were
pictures.
there and she wasn't there.
Yeah. So I had to clarify that, no, I did not attend. I just didn't see her in any pictures, which she was like, why would I be in them?
That is really fun. I also realized one of my friends has this gag about podcasts where every podcast in the history of the world starts as a podcast about a particular thing, whether that's TV or film or whatever, and then eventually just becomes like people talking about what they've been up to, what their thoughts are. Like 10 minutes into this podcast and we've talked about you just watching Clarkson's Farm and us chatting to, friends or work people about weddings they attended months ago. Very, very
I
good.
mean, I'm okay with that. We have a lot to catch up on.
I have actually the corollary to that theory from my friend. I don't know if you saw this clip. Donald Trump was speaking at a rally in New Jersey last week, and he kind of went off script and just started talking about the film The Silence of the Lambs, featuring Anthony Hopkins. You across this thing?
I didn't see it. What happened?
The clip that sort of went viral, he just kind of out of nowhere just started saying, Silence of the Lambs. Do you guys know about this movie? It's a great film starring the late, great Hannibal Lecter.
Silence of the Lamb. Has anyone ever seen The Silence of the Lambs? The late, great Hannibal Lecter is a wonderful man. He oftentimes would have a friend for dinner. Remember the last scene? Excuse me, I'm about to have a friend for dinner as this poor doctor walked by. I'm about to have a friend for dinner.
And so to me, this is the reverse of the theory that every film podcast just becomes mates hanging out and talking shit. Donald Trump is morphing into a film podcaster. He is just going off-piste and talking about these random movies that won lots of Academy Awards in the early 90s. It's kind of confusing because Hannibal Lecter or Anthony Hopkins, the actor who played him, they're neither late. I mean, they're definitely not late. They're both still alive. Well, in the Red Dragon universe, Hannibal Lecter is alive. Anthony Hopkins is certainly alive. And I wouldn't know if I don't know if I would call one of the most famous cannibals in fiction great either. I strongly encourage you to seek out this clip. There's allegedly 80,000 people in this stadium where he's talking about this. It's very funny.
It's amazing. And also, like, does it surprise me that that's one of his favorite films or the film he references? Maybe not.
It is a good film. Jodie Foster, she's great in it as well.
Yeah, when she gets the hose, puts the lotion on and
Oh
gets
my
the
God.
hose. I always think of that scene.
Absolutely.
Oh, that song,
Yeah, it
horses?
gets the
White
hose
horses?
again,
Yeah.
and puts the lotion.
Yeah,
Gosh,
yeah.
that's a throwback.
What a moment.
Hey, should we get into today's episode?
I thought you were going to say, should we get Trump on the show to chat more?
Look, there's a few different things we wanted to cover on the show today. Baby Reindeer, which we've spoken about a couple of times already. It's on track to become the most watched show in the history of Netflix and perhaps one of the most controversial shows on Netflix as well. We're going to look at its phenomenal response, why it just keeps getting more and more viewers, and some of the complicated questions the show's raised about the way real life stories are told in fictional forms and the responsibility creators and audiences have when engaging with this kind of work. We're also going to talk about one of our favorite shows that we've watched recently, a show that we're both a little bit late to. Thomas actually has been hounding us to get onto this for a while, and we finally did, and we're going to talk about it while he's away, so sucked in, Thomas, too bad. But first, Mel, the federal budget was unveiled on Tuesday night. And before everyone listening switches off to go listen to Andrew Huberman or call her daddy or whatever podcasts normal people listen to, I promise we're only going to briefly discuss federal politics and what is in store for arts and culture in particular. Throughout my career as a journalist, Mel, I've generally had to cover the budget, either being like in the lockup or staying up late editing stories, working on podcasts to explain what's going on, who are the winners and losers, what is the budget narrative, what does this mean for the future of the country. Thankfully, in my current job, I do not have to spend budget night working. In fact, instead of even watching the Treasurer's speech, I was watching another show that is going to be my recommendation on Impress Your Friends. I'll say more on that later, but did you watch any of the budget coverage?
No, I didn't watch it. I did read all of our coverage, went straight to that winners and losers infographic, which always amuses me. And then I did read, of course, Ross Gittin's takeaways from it, which I think really allowed me to understand inflation and recession for once.
Well, yeah, some of the winners and losers, I don't know if it was our one or the ABC's one, where they were like, losers, sheep farmers, winners, sheep. I don't really know what's going on there, but
it's so good.
Happy for the sheep.
Let me explain that to you because I do understand. Jeremy has prepared me for this question. No, so I didn't watch it, but I did kind of read the outlines, and then I was very keen to see if there was any support for arts and culture, for which there was not a lot.
Yeah, so I went onto the actual budget government website. I went to budget paper 2, I believe. I went to budget measures, outlines and expenditures, and I went to the whatever department that arts is in. It's sort of like infrastructure, defense, health, blah, 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 everything under the sun. And then at the end, you got art stacked on. And there is like half a page of arts budget spending. There's not a lot, as you mentioned, and what is in there is kind of minimal in terms of the amount of money involved. But there's a couple of things I think worth mentioning. They touch on things that we talk about on this show. They touch on areas to do with the future of Australian arts and TV and film and all these kinds of things. Our colleague at the paper, Linda Morris, has been reporting on the financial crisis, really, that's been impacting Australia's art schools, places like AFTRS that train the next generation of people who make TV and film and screenwriters. There's also NIDA, the National Institute of Dramatic Art, which trains up actors. They've not been doing very well financially over the last few years, but the government stepped in. They received a $115 million boost. That's pretty exciting for the future of Australian arts education, isn't it?
Yeah, that's huge. And like, if we're going to do a breakdown of winners and losers for arts, they are a clear winner. They were kind of getting a lot of money from this budget, and it's increasing over the years quite substantially. And I think that's a brilliant thing because it's impossible to be an artist today. So I'm glad to see that we're at least attempting to nurture young talent at the schools. But then obviously we're going to have to make sure that there are jobs and supports once they enter the industry as professionals.
Exactly. And that's sort of the next part of that kind of pipeline. And there was a little bit there as well. There was an extra $14.5 million to help produce more children's television shows. You know, it's Bluey has been a big Australian kids TV export. I would kind of like us to go back to that crazy era where we grew up, where it wasn't just kind of animated. We had these live action, scripted, wacky kids programs like Round the Twist and Ship to Shore that, you know, created and nurtured and incubated a generation of Australian kind of talent and taught people how to write and direct and edit and do lighting. I don't know if $14.5 million is going to be enough to do that. I know we've talked before about these bigger policy questions around streaming quotas. How can the government get more out of the presence of Netflix and Disney and Amazon and these big companies to actually fund and make more Australian shows? Netflix obviously has had big success with Heartbreak High, but it's fair to say there's more to do across the board. How do you feel about that investment in kids television?
I think, as you say, it doesn't sound like enough money to substantially change the dial. Obviously, what it does highlight is the federal government's priority in supporting that industry in particular and giving that industry a boost, which I think is commendable. But I don't think it's anything that's going to really revolutionise the making of children's TV programs here. I mean, I was just thinking, wouldn't it be good, like back to the days of Nickelodeon, except without what we now know about Nickelodeon, all those kid shows we grew up in. It would be great to see them all. I think obviously Bluey has been, you know, shown the potential for that market, not only here but abroad. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's room for growth there, and this is a good sign for that industry.
Yeah, and Bluey's certainly doing great in terms of representation of cattle dogs in suburban Brisbane. But, you know, there's a lot more there to tap into.
Oh my gosh, this is the farming episode. Everything comes back to the farm.
The content farms that we toil in, you know, everything's about farming. And then finally, I think the other thing, just to touch on live music, which again we've spoken about again and again, and just Australian music more generally facing serious challenges here. The government has extended a grant, this time worth nearly $9 million, to help support live music. That's money that can go to festivals and venues to help put on shows. And I guess similar to the kids' TV cash injection, it's recognizing that there are problems and it's putting some money into them. It just sort of feels like, and maybe we're a bit, maybe not biased is not the right word, but maybe more closely attuned to how severe these issues are, because our jobs day in, day out involve talking to people, making this kind of stuff, telling us about the challenges of trying to get Australian artists broken in this country, internationally, what it's like to do so in an environment flooded by Spotify and YouTube. International companies have bought up and basically own most of the live music scene here now. And in TV land, the kinds of shows that used to just provide jobs and incomes to every person involved in the sector, they don't really exist anymore. People work on shows for like 3 to 6 months and then are left for that. Like, this is a big fundamental transformation that has happened to the production of arts and culture in this country. And it just feels like it needs a very, very big wholesale thought through, joined up response that isn't quite there yet. And I'm not trying to say that the government won't do that in the future. They've got these reviews, they've got recommendations coming out about things like streaming. But at this point in time, it feels like this budget is a little bit more acknowledging there are problems and helping a little bit, but not really tackling it wholesale. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And like, the cost of living crisis is obviously really affecting live music venues here. I think some of all arts organisations are struggling, but I think some of those with the older subscriber bases are a bit more insulated, mainly because their demographic do still have discretionary income. But a lot of young people go to live music and live music festivals, and that is kind of the first thing they will cut off their list when they're trying to save money. So I do think that industry in particular needs a really helping hand. And as we've seen with things like Splendor being cancelled, it is kind of crumbling in many places.
Yeah, really important point. I think before we get into Baby Reindeer and the other TV things we wanted to discuss, a couple of news things I wanted to run through with you. Let's start in the world of music. So last week when we were discussing Drake and Kendrick's beef, I threw out a prediction that Kendrick's Not Like Us, which is considered, I think, both the catchiest song and probably most triumphant song in this beef. It was sort of the one that just like sealed the deal that he'd won. Predicted that could go to number 1 on the Billboard charts. Guess what, Mel? It debuted at number 1 on the Billboard charts this week.
Wow. Taylor Swift, she's down bad.
She is struggling. She is struggling. I'm not that surprised this song went ballistic. I personally have played it like 300 to 400 times a day since it came out. And actually 4 of the top 10 songs on the Billboard charts this week are Drake and Kendrick diss tracks. Taylor Swift has gone from number 1, her song Fortnite with Post Malone, all the way down to number 4. Hip-hop's back, baby.
Wow. Okay. Here's my hot take on this.
Yes.
Do you think that because actually Taylor Swift is a bit of a part of their beef, right? Like,
oh, that's
they're
true.
Singing about Taylor Swift. One of the songs is called Taylor Made. They're kind of fighting over who's better bros with Taylor, and they're using Taylor to diss each other about their record release dates. Are the Swifties sending them up?
Okay. So immediately my answer to that is no. And secondly, my response to that is, I can't believe you're trying to make this about Taylor Swift. But to your credit, yeah, that is, I guess, the testament to how pervasive Taylor Swift is in our modern era of culture. She has worked with Drake in ads before for like Apple Music. Kendrick featured on her song. You talked about Jack Antonoff earlier, her mainstay producer. He produced 616 in LA, one of the tracks from Kendrick. You can't escape the Taylorverse, even when you think you've escaped the Taylorverse by getting into the rap world. So look, begrudgingly, I might have to hand you that one a little bit.
I am surprised that I thought maybe we would see 1 or 2 songs up there. I am surprised by how many, mainly because I thought people would be reading about the feud, but I didn't think as many people would be actively seeking out the songs and then listening to them a lot, particularly as it went on and on. So, yeah, I was kind of surprised.
I think that's what makes this beef quite unique in the history of beefs, is just the availability of music now in the rapid fire way they're being released. Some of these songs have got over 100 million streams on Spotify and YouTube. And it's so easy now to go from listening to one to then listening to the other to listening to the one that's response to that one. It's really, really interesting. I don't think they're going to last in the charts that long. I think this captured the period where everyone was really, really, really engaged. I think it also says something about how a lot of people just did not fuck with the Tortured Poets department. Taylor's songs tend to stick around for a bit, but the fact that she's just got one fortnight clinging on and that's sort of slipping away says something about the, I guess, how largely that album is going to loom in pop culture. It doesn't seem very largely.
And did Macklemore ride this wave all the way to the top too?
Macklemore has not, I don't think. I don't think that song was released on streaming platforms. It might have just made it onto YouTube, but there seems to be some issue there with where you can listen to it. Most of those listens seem to be happening on his Instagram, which I don't believe, I could be wrong, I don't believe is captured when it comes to Billboard chart rankings.
Yeah, okay, missed his mark.
He is in Australia right now. He's playing a bunch of sold-out shows. He just came from Sydney, where he popped in to the Sydney pro-Palestine encampments. It's obviously he's associated with that campaign now after releasing the protest song last week, and he's in Melbourne. In fact, I'm down to go see him at Rod Laver Arena tonight. He's playing a bunch of sold-out shows there, which will be fun to check out. And Mel, there's one other music thing I wanted to touch on. When Beyonce released her album that we spoke about earlier this year, one of the goals, she was quite direct, of that project was to try and reclaim the black history of country music. She collaborated with a bunch of black country artists, including Virginia artist Shaboozey. He was featured on Spaghetti and Sweet Honey Buckin' off her album Cowboy Carter. Well, Beyonce and Shaboozey made history this week. For the first time ever in the history of the United States of America, 2 black country songs have gone number 1 consecutively on the country charts. That happened when Beyonce's Texas Hold'em was replaced this week by Shaboozey's latest single, A Bar Song.
Someone pour me up a double shot of whiskey. They know me and Jack Daniels got a history. There's a party downtown near 5th Street. Everybody at the bar getting tipsy. Everybody at the bar getting tipsy.
So Bar Song, in brackets, Tipsy, is an interpolation of rapper Jaquan's 2004 track, Tipsy. Do you remember that track from the club?
Yeah, I do.
Everybody in the club getting tipsy. Everybody in the club getting tipsy.
Jaquan, kind of like a one-hit wonder, but that song was very, very, very popular. It features in the soundtracks of a bunch of movies from that time as well. Jaquan is from Missouri, so there is like a nice southern sort of crossover there as well. I really like this song, A Bar Song. It feels like very fun, modern, like country that is resonating with people for a reason. It's nice to see Shaboozey throw some respect to Jaquan, to leverage the Beyonce collab into doing this. This is a pretty big moment for music, I guess. As Beyonce said, I want to do this, and she seemingly has. That's a pretty strong testament to her power.
Yeah, it's huge. It's a great song, and I think when, not that long ago when we were sitting here talking about all of Thomas Mitchell's favourite artists, Luke Combs, Morgan Wallen, we were talking about how it was still a very male white area and how fantastic to see people of colour, male, female, kind of on the top of that list. And I'm really interested to see where country goes and how these sounds keep being interpolated and made anew and changed. So I think this is great and pretty exciting. And I will say, I think that people get deterred when they think of it as Beyonce's country album.
Yeah.
And I think people just have this image of white and stale for country.
Yeah.
And it's just not that anymore. And Waxahachie, when we were talking about her, kind of proved that point as well. But I would say give these musicians a chance. Don't be deterred by this country label, because it doesn't really mean what it once meant.
Absolutely. And we talked about it on our episode discussing that album, such a long history of black artists in the country genre. But this current phase of really significant chart success and conversations around who gets to be counted as country, you can sort of pin back to Lil Nas X's Old Town Road, and the fact that forced this conversation. That's a queer black rapper forcing his way into the country charts. Then Beyonce bringing it all together, and now Shaboozey doing this. It's kind of wild that it's not even in our lifetime, in like the last 6 or 7 years, there has been this massive shift in what has been one of the most white and generally considered conservative genres to have ever existed. It's really, really interesting to see unfold.
Yeah, and I kind of love it that because it was that Beyonce song, was it?
Daddy Lessons?
Yeah. I kind of love the idea that all of this is motivated by the revenge of that not being
exactly.
able to be on the country list.
I mean, yeah,
So,
Cowboy Carter kind of her
great.
diss track at the entire country genre, and it's working.
Yeah, so good.
All right, let's get into Baby Reindeer.
You say this woman's stalking you?
Yeah, like 6 months maybe.
Why'd it take you so long to report it?
I think she needs help. She comes to my work, my house. She sends me emails like all the time.
Are any threatening towards you?
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that's particularly threatening.
There's a reason you're keeping her around, and maybe it's what she gives you.
Got really manly hands, haven't you?
So quick recap for anyone who hasn't yet seen the show, but like I said, it's been number 1 on Netflix in Australia and around the world for a number of weeks now. So assuming most people listening to this have seen it, the show came out of nowhere. It blew up on Netflix. Comedian Richard Gadd based this show that he wrote and stars in on his own real experience of being stalked by a woman. The show looks at that, how he handled it, as well as the broader issue of assault and trauma. It sparked an enormous amount of conversation for a few different reasons. Every episode of the show opens with Netflix kind of caption saying that this is based on a true story. Gadd has said that it's based on things that happened to him. It's about real people. And a lot of the debate about this show has been around how much detail was provided about the characters in the show, how easy it was for some people online to seemingly find and identify who these characters are based on. In some instances, they seem to have identified the wrong person, but the conversation has become so much bigger than just what you see in the 6 episodes on Netflix and sparked really, really fascinating debate around the responsibility of Richard Gadd in making the show, whether he should have changed details to make it harder for people to find them, the culpability of audiences in wanting to find these people and then sort of holding them, pointing at them and sending them death threats in some instances, Netflix's responsibility in making a show based on not just a comedian's real life trauma, but perhaps their responsibility in making sure enough details were changed to avoid the situations. There's a lot to talk about. I think this has become the big TV controversy of the year, if not the last couple of years. But I wanted to start by asking you, did you see the interview with the person who's being dubbed the real life Martha? Martha is the stalker in the show. The woman is called Fiona Harvey. That's who has been identified, and she's certainly self-identified herself as the person Martha is based on. Did you see her interview with Piers Morgan this week?
Oh man, I saw it as much as you can see it when you have like your hands over your eyes as you're watching something. It was, I found it quite hard to watch. And I kept thinking, you know how in Harry Potter there are those like paintings and the subjects of the painting every so often like leap out of their frame into like, you know, into the real world and into different situations. It was just like watching this like fictional thing and real life kind of become completely intermingled. And even on the screen when they were like cutting together Fiona Harvey and Martha scenes.
Yeah.
It was like just quite an odd experience to watch. And the whole time I kept thinking, well, this is the Netflix sequel to Baby Reindeer, isn't it, that we're seeing? This would be the second season.
Oh my God, totally. It could have been a scene from a show, yeah.
Yeah, totally. Gadd being a liar, the collapse of the career. And it also just feels like such a Martha and Donnie thing to get embroiled in. I found it quite difficult to watch. What did you think?
No, I completely agree. And I guess like, you know, Piers Morgan isn't necessarily who I go to when I think about journalistic ethics in talking about this. You know, she was paid for her interview. She's now said she wasn't paid enough and she wants like £1 million. I think she was paid like £250. And Piers Morgan says, oh, but we also paid for her to get a haircut and we gave her a nice car to and from the studio. So there is a whole strange element around the ethics of checkbook journalism as well. But, you know, this person clearly has various issues, it's fair to say, and sort of mining them for content in a Piers Morgan YouTube show didn't really feel like great. It's worth pointing out that she denies some of the specifics of what her character Martha is said to have done. She says, I didn't stalk him. I didn't interact with him for as long as the show suggests. I did email him and tweet him, but only a handful of times. She says, and this is a really crucial one, the show says Martha was like sentenced for committing a crime around stalking. She says that never happened to her. So there's a lot there, given that the show is explicit in saying that this is based on a true story. Gad says that he changed details to make it harder for people to find out who these characters were based on. He also said right from the start he didn't want people to do that. But a lot of people have made the point, and I kind of agree with it, he didn't change that many details. People found Fiona Harvey because she, like Martha, is an older Scottish woman. She looks very similar to the character. She's also a lawyer. She has been previously accused of harassing other people and stalking them. She frequented the bar where Gad used to work. She visited him at one of his comedy shows, and people found tweets that she'd made that were very, very similar to lines of dialogue that the character was given in the show. So leaving aside the weirdness of the Morgan interview, which I just don't really think reflects well on anyone involved, do you think Gad changed enough on this one?
Oh, it's a really tough one, and it's a really interesting one because art has often been based on real life experiences, right? And often people have played a guessing game about who an artist's work is about in any form. But I guess what's different here is the reach and scale of Netflix and the development of social media and the kind of armchair detectives that have spawned. I'm hesitant to say that Gad needed to change more because part of what people resonated with was, I guess, what felt like the emotional honesty of this, and that is why it was so powerful. Obviously, him playing himself has added to all of that. But at the same time, I obviously recognize that art has real life consequences. So I'm not entirely sure what the solution here is, but I know a lot of people are talking about whether Netflix kind of did enough, and Gad has obviously spoken out a lot, saying that they've gone to great lengths to disguise her. I do find it hard to think that Netflix wouldn't have covered themselves legally on this because obviously in that interview, Fiona Harvey was talking about potentially suing Netflix. But I do find it hard to think that they wouldn't have done their due diligence in terms of the legal side of this. But where the boundary is between recognizing someone and not recognizing someone, I don't know if there is a clear-cut answer to that. I think it's a hard one.
It's a really good point, and there's a lot of different facets to that specific question as well. So Netflix in Europe is headquartered in the Netherlands, which means that it isn't subject at the moment to the UK kind of media regulatory system. And there's been some conversation from critics and commentators in the UK that the BBC couldn't have gotten away with something like this. And in fact, there is legislation currently in the UK Parliament to try to bring Netflix within its media regulatory framework. So people like Fiona Harvey could say, hey, I don't like the way that I was represented. Can I get some compensation, or do you have to change stuff for it? That's an ongoing issue. Netflix, it's also worth pointing out, has been in hot water for things around this before. When they released Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story about Jeffrey Dahmer, they were criticized for making that show without the consent of victims' families. I think that was less an legal issue and more a moral issue. The Netflix policy chief, Benjamin King, was actually grilled about this in UK parliamentary hearings last week. And it's interesting because he said, we didn't want to anonymize the show or make it too generic to the point where it was no longer Richard Gadd's story, because that would undermine the intent behind the show. I personally wouldn't be comfortable with a world in which we decided it was better that Richard was silenced and not allowed to tell the story. I kind of feel like that sounds like a really good point, but then it is sort of these two drastically opposed options without any consideration for what could happen in the middle. You could tell, and lots of shows do this, you could tell a very similar story where perhaps the character doesn't have exactly the same traits down to their profession and their nationality. There are ways to make these things a little bit less obvious when you're in an era where this is how people consume TV and film and podcasts and all these kinds of things. I kind of think I feel less critical of Richard than I do towards Netflix. I think, he made this as a one-person show for Edinburgh in 2019. He's maybe 100 people will come and see this show. It doesn't live on in memory. You're not going to rewind and take a screenshot and see who can find that looks like this person. And so he's told it honestly and authentically to himself. He's written it. Netflix has picked it up. I feel like it is on Netflix, or it's on any company who is streaming and telling this kind of story, to then be like, okay, we are the biggest TV platform that has ever existed in the history of the world. We've been in situations like this before. Is it time to sit down and run the ruler over all of this and say, have we done enough here? And it seems like they just hadn't. And I think it's interesting because even if Fiona Harvey, the quote-unquote real Martha, isn't able to successfully sue or, the show stays up or whatever she wants doesn't happen, I kind of think this will change the way that Netflix and other networks make shows like this. I just think no one wants to be in like a quote-unquote Baby Reindeer situation again. And whether it's through regulatory reform or just like policy changes at Netflix, which is generally from people I talk to, they say that it's much more lax than national broadcasters like the BBC and the ABC, which because they're public institutions have such specific editorial policies and guidelines about how you tell a story like this. Netflix is a little bit more of a cowboy. I think that's probably likely to change, and I think probably for the better because they're the ones who make millions and millions, if not billions of dollars off these kinds of stories, and a lot of people then just become collateral damage. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. The amount of money involved in this and the amount of people getting rich off this is, I think, what kind of takes this into a different level. Because I'm just kind of thinking, like, if he had written a memoir about this, he kind of could have said the same things, but the consequences would not have been the same.
Yeah, even if that memoir became a massive success and sold 100,000 copies, which would be amazing for a memoir from a comedian, that's a drop in the ocean compared to the 60 million people, it seems like, who've watched this show.
Yeah, for sure. And like, I think Netflix didn't help themselves by playing how much of a true story it was in every episode. Like, that didn't help them because, of course, a lot of people then will want to investigate the true story. Though I will say, I don't think, obviously the name was going around in certain areas online, but I don't think Fiona Harvey was known as a name generally until she put herself onto Piers Morgan's show, because I think a lot of, like, the Daily Mail had interviewed her but didn't name her. So I actually think Fiona Harvey probably, in a way, also, and like she says she did it to kind of, she needed to own the story now. Yeah. But, maybe there's ways around that in terms of, the ethics of media as well in playing into this story.
Yeah, well, we were talking about this at work because there's another person involved in this, the alleged perpetrator. If you see the show, there's a person in the show, again, based on a real incident, who does something very bad to Richard, which he assaults Richard, and people thought they had found that person, and they named them online. And that person then tweeted or put on social media, hey, I'm not the person involved in this. I'm not who the character is based on. I'm going to report any kinds of threats made against me to the police. And then Richard also named that person and said, hey, it's not this person. So that person's identified themselves. We were talking at work when we cover this, do we name that person? I sort of lent against doing so. This is why I keep saying that person, not saying their name, even though you can find them on Reddit or on social media, because it's one thing for someone to say something on a thread or even on their own Instagram. It's another when a big reputable media institution or someone like Piers Morgan blasts that out to millions and millions more people. And particularly in the case where this person is saying, I'm not identified, it feels a bit shit to be like, name of person here says they are not the bad guy from Baby Reindeer. Well, I wasn't even thinking about them, and now I am because you've told me their name.
Yeah, it's so complicated. And like, I guess you gave a few examples of when this has happened before in terms of shows based on real life experiences and people going down the rabbit hole of trying to find them out. There are so many where it hasn't happened. Like, I think I May Destroy You, which was based on Michaela Cole's own experience, or she has been a survivor of sexual assault. You didn't see people trying to figure out who that perpetrator was. I mean, it's just such a hard line between when you think someone's going to be recognizable and when you think a show is going to take off to an extent that people are going to try and dox certain characters in it. I do think, like, yes, Netflix can do more, but I do also think there are limits to what they can control, particularly when social media kind of has a life of its own.
I think that's a really good point. I think that sort of brings us to the other part of all this is like the audience or the people involved who are doing this kind of a thing. It's not my job to like lecture people or anything like that. We live in a moment in which this is how things work, whether it's, you're laughing because it is kind of my job to
Yeah, I was waiting for here comes the lecture.
No, I guess what I'm trying to say is, as much as I wish people weren't turning every true crime podcast or every TV show, documentary or fictional or whatever into a real life like Reddit or Facebook group where they think they can solve these mysteries, as much as I wish that wasn't happening because of the obvious negative consequences of that when they get it wrong, which they often do, that's the world we live in. So we just have to accept that's what it is. Interested in thinking about like why that is what it is. Like why do people feel the compulsion to do that? And a lot was made about the fact that everyone wanted to figure out who Martha was. They didn't want to figure out who the perpetrator who assaulted Richard was. I think that does go to the fact that like maybe seeing a woman in that kind of threatening role is not something we're used to. And so that was seen as being a bit strange and like, let's figure out who this person is. They're so wacky and there are so many breadcrumbs for us to follow here. But it has just become part of how so many pieces of culture are dissected. And it seems reductive to me to not just engage with the work. Like Richard Gadd is making a story that he has said from day one is not about saying this person's bad. It's about understanding why people would do something like this. And he says she's a victim in this as much as I am because of her mental health and what she's gone through and the ongoing ramifications of trauma. That's what the show's about. And that's interesting conversations you and I have had on the show with Thomas. People are having, you know, all around the place when they watch the show. But then on Reddit in particular and some other forums, all that's stripped away. And it's just, hey, I found like this new story from this year that links this person to that person. A couple of questions for you. Like, how much culpability do we have in all of this? And why do you think people can't stop doing that?
Yeah, I have to say, and maybe it's because I think, as previously discussed, everything's a lie, that I've never watched a show and ever felt the need to then go and see whether it's real. Like watching the show, the only thing I looked up was Richard Gadd because I wanted to know what else he had made. Or like I think even back to watching The Crown, all these fact and fiction, what's true, what's not. I don't really care. I just presume that everything that's created comes through someone's lens. So someone else is definitely going to disagree with it. So I haven't quite ever felt that need to see whether something is true because I think there's obviously a veracity in approximating the truth or a truth for a person. Why do people do it? I think maybe it adds something. It obviously adds something to the show for a lot of people for the fact that knowing it is real or based in truth obviously adds something to the show for a lot of people. And then I do think it's just easy once you're in that kind of rabbit hole of looking up what's real and what's not, to then kind of continue doing that and go down the loop of exploring the real lives of everyone. Maybe it's that voyeurism that social media has kind of trained us in, the kind of looking into other people's lives. And it is almost like, I mean, we were talking before about there being a second season to this. It is almost like an addendum to the shows. Like you watch the show and then it's not just about watching the show, it's then about researching it. It's kind of becomes part of the process of watching television, I think, for people. Do you ever do it? Are you a looker-upper of truth?
Well, no, first I want to say I think that's a really great explanation as to the appeal of it because some of that does ring true for me. Like I don't feel the urge to do it in a show like this. Like again, like I was kind of curious as to Richard Gadd's backstory, but it didn't occur to me to be like, oh, it's based on a true story. Who are these bad people involved? But I enjoy doing it like if I'm watching a historical fiction show or something like The Dropout, you know, which is based on real, like, you know, journalism that has happened or a book or whatever, and being like, oh, cool, like what context can I add? Like what have they changed from the book to the screen? Because like you said, everyone's changing everything. Everyone's making this with different intents, and it's sometimes interesting to figure out what they left behind or what they tweaked. That I do. I think that's a pretty normal thing for people to do. But I think, yeah, trying to turn everything into a true crime series is where things seem to have gotten a little bit out of hand. I guess this is me lecturing people now again, which I'm trying not to do. But I mean, yeah, is there any merit to it? I guess if we want to be sort of generous to people who do it, because it's not like, you know, a bunch of weird freaks we're talking about. It's like many, many, many people. And I think the interrogation of this show is why it has been most watched for so long, right? This is driving a lot of viewers to it. What is perhaps the most generous interpretation of this? People are trying to understand why people would do something like this. They just want to solve a mystery. They think they're being helpful. Any kind of generous interpretations you can think of?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's there's a gradient, right? I think, to be fair, I think it's perfectly fine to watch a show and want to Google like whether facts are true about it or to see how much of it is true. But there's a big difference between people doing that and then people kind of doxing and naming
speculating
and
who they think it is
defaming
and
and slandering. Yeah, and kicking off those whole kind of subgroups that do that. So I think there's a really big difference. Like, yeah, I totally get why people want to find out more about a show and they're interested in it and the context helps them. But I think the dangerous part is when it's the naming and shaming and it goes too far, which is probably a minority of the internet, really, in the whole grand scheme of things. But that's the area of concern because that then does have real world consequences for people.
It is so fascinating to think about. When we first mentioned this TV show on our show, it was Thomas doing it on Impress Your Friends, like, you know, a couple of months ago. Did not expect it to either be the most watched show potentially in the history of Netflix, which could make it the most watched show in the history of the world, or be something that is part of like UK parliamentary hearings and lead into conversations about doxing and why people shouldn't do it. But on one hand, how amazing is television to spark these kinds of conversations? On the other hand, kind of a bit sad that we just kind of can't have nice and important things without people losing their minds.
I know. And also, isn't it insane? Like we were talking about mid-TV not that long ago, and then a show like this, which is so different, so, you know, out there, not conventional, not AI formulated, intensely unique, is like this show that has won Netflix. Like, surely that's got to make them rethink a bit what they're doing as well, the success of something like this.
Well, no, and exactly. And I think it relates to this conversation of whether they thought it through, because we talked earlier about how this came out of nowhere, right? Like for most TV shows that are being dropped by big streamers, particularly ones that they think are going to go off, you get, you know, emails in advance. This show's coming out. You can watch early episodes. You can interview the talent. You can do some stories about them. You get people hyped. None of that happened anywhere in the world for Baby Reindeer. So I wonder whether it was kind of acquired. They just thought, cool, this is like a cool Edinburgh show. It's like an interesting, dark comedy. Off it goes. If they thought it was going to be such a big show, they probably would have, in my view, I think probably run that ruler over it and thought what the consequences could be here.
Or at least manage the situation better with all of the people who were involved.
Absolutely. Yeah, because the other thing that Fiona Harvey said is that she did not even know the show was coming out. And I feel like when you're doing a story on someone as a journalist, whether you're making a documentary, whether making a fictional show that you're pitching as a true story, picking up the phone and calling the person who's quote unquote the bad guy is really tough, but it is an important part of the job. And it does feel like that was something that should have been done that wasn't done here, even just to give them a heads up or to say, hey, what concerns do you potentially have that we could factor in? That feels like something that could have happened early on in this process to avoid this kind of situation.
Yeah, for sure. They could have protected themselves. And I mean, maybe they did. We don't know. That's only her claim. But I presume Netflix would have told us if they had spoken to her by now. But yes, they could have definitely protected themselves from a lot of this backlash by doing that.
Yeah, look, I'm going to make a guess and say this might not be the last time we talk about Baby Reindeer. But we have another kind of trauma-inflected show, but a much more fun one to talk about. This is one that Thomas has been messaging us about for a long time to watch. And really interestingly, the only reason I actually got around to watching it is I was out on Saturday night, I came home from a friend's birthday party and I wasn't quite ready to go to sleep. So I just watched, you know, like you put on a show that you watched ages ago. It's kind of comfortable. You don't need to grapple with complicated ideas. You're like, I'll watch this as I fall to sleep. So I turned to the In-Betweeners. And, you know, we love that show. And I was like, oh, I wonder what they're up to now. And I'm like, oh, cool. These guys are in that show. I watched that. And Will, what's he up to? I haven't seen him in anything. And I went on his Wikipedia page, Simon Bird, who plays Will from The In-Betweeners, and he is the director of this show that Thomas has been yelling at us to watch, Such Brave Girls. So I thought, what? I should actually watch this show. And I did, and I loved it.
Mum, can you pick me up, please? I'm having big feelings.
I can only afford one daughter having a breakdown at a time.
You coward!
Well, the thing about Josie is that she's been experimenting with some ideas.
Well, that sounds good.
No, Dev. No, it's not.
Maybe she'll spot me across the room and realise I'm the love of her life.
Don't think so. Sometimes me and Mum forget you're even there when you're standing right next to us.
Billy Johnson.
Thomas. Mitchell also bullied me into it, and it got to such an extent that he was like messaging me saying, "You're watching Such Brave Girls," and I kind of like I got a bit belligerent. I was like, "You don't know me. You don't know what I like."
Yeah.
And then I did put it on mainly so that he would stop asking me about it. And like maybe this is an early call. It's only May, but I'm going with best comedy of 2024.
Wow. Big call. Why don't you tell us what the show's about?
Yeah, it is a real word of mouth show. So it's on Stan in Australia. It's a 6-part BBC comedy and it's created by Kat Sadler, who I hadn't heard of before this, but is such a talent. It follows single mum Deb, who's played by Louise Brealey, and she's got 2 daughters, which is the press Josie, who is kind of played to chef's kiss by Sadler, and her boy mad sister Billy, who is played by Sadler's real life sister, Lizzie Davidson. So their husband and dad, he's gone to the shop one day to get tea, which becomes a recurring kind of joke, and he's never returned. And they're all trying to get themselves out of their own personal and family troubles. It is so funny. It's so moving. It's very bold. I absolutely loved this. And I think In-Betweeners is a good one. If you like Sharon Horgan's stuff. Yeah, Rain Dogs, there's they're kind of comparison points, but it's also like they're quite short episodes. So I almost watched it all in one night because it was so fun and delightful to watch.
It's really good. And I have not heard that many people talking about it, which kind of surprises me for how high caliber I think it is. Like, Kat Sadler is obviously a brilliant writer. It's a great idea and the dialogue and stories are so good. She's an amazing performer as well. And Louise Brealey, I remember her from Sherlock, the Benedict Cumberbatch, Martin Freeman one, and I always found her presence in that really intriguing and interesting. And seeing her play a very different role is also like, it's so unexpected in terms of the kinds of turns each character makes. It's pitched this comedy. It does have in-betweenery vibes in terms of these young people talking very frankly about sex and the awkwardness of being a teenager. But it is so unexpected in the ways it goes. You'll go from a really funny scene to a very, very, very dark and complicated statement from a character about a traumatic experience that they've had. But I think it finds that line where you are understanding the complex backstories of all of these people that are making them act in certain ways. And I guess that's where the Baby Reindeer comp comes. And it doesn't sort of treat their trauma as a pithy thing. You understand and you empathize, but you also don't wallow in it. You don't feel bad. You don't feel grim about the state of the world. It's kind of empathetic and funny at the same time. It's pretty rare for a show, I think, to nail it, that tone in that way.
Yeah, agree. An inferior show would just feel like a mess, and we would say the tone was uneven, but it does tread that balance so well. And the episodes are sometimes focused on like one little bit, like they go camping or there's a funeral, and so it kind of plays out in real time with them in a way. And I think like it kind of reminded me when I was watching Succession, and I used to want to go back and listen to the lines because there's just so many good lines that you kind of feel like you're still digesting one and then something else has come up. And I had that same feeling with this. There are so many good lines and there's so much said with so little, like short, sharp, pithy dialogue that, I just thought it was very impressive.
Yeah, these British comedy writers, maybe because so many of them come from writing for stage, whether at comedy festivals or for theatre, there's so much good dialogue that you like are kind of trying to understand a joke and they've made 2 more already. But then this is the kind of show I could actually watch like 4, 5, 6, 7 seasons of, watching these girls grow up and their mum sort of deal with them. She's maybe like the worst mum in television since Lucille Bluth from Arrested Development. But again, you kind of understand. It's like she's terrible. The way she talks to her kids can be so dismissive in a way that's like funny and like a bit shocking, but you still feel for her. That's the crazy other thing about this show, is that even though so many of these characters are kind of like comic relief because of how mean or like dumb they are, even like the sort of boyfriend that the mum has for a bit, who I find kind of annoying, 2 or 3 episodes in, you're like, oh man, this guy's got his own shit going on as well. Like, I really feel for this dude.
Yeah, it's not a cruel show. It doesn't punch down. It is empathetic to all of them. And even the mum, it's like, yes, she's cruel, but part of the reason she's cruel is that she's trying to get her kids out of this situation. She wants money. She's trying to move them all forward because she's suffered in her life from kind of having the same illusions as some of her kids. So even the cruelness is kind of explained. I thought the two sisters, just their bond and their differences and the way they bounced off each other was kind of really the highlight of the show. Their riposte was amazing.
You said favorite comedy of the year so far. I would agree. I mean, I think it's probably neck and neck between this and the latest season of Hacks for me, which I am really, really enjoying. But as far as like a new show goes, this is like easily right up there, and very excitingly was just renewed, I think, this month for a second season. That's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I know. That's the only thing I was sad about. And maybe this is a strategy. A lot of these kind of BBC comedies only are 6-parters. I think of Starstruck as well, short, sharp season. You know, it does leave you wanting more. You don't get tired of it. So now I'm really keen for the second season.
And I hope it delivers, you know, this kind of classic sophomore syndrome where Kat Sadler's like, I've been working up to making this show. I've got these ideas. You use them all. I hope she's got some stuff in the tank. I mean, there's nothing to suggest the quality will drop off, but we have just seen this pattern before in television. I hope they find a way to keep it going. And like, I think because the characters, like you say, no one's punching down, it's not cruel. They're the kinds of people you could just like, you know, my ongoing rant about how I want TV to go on for years. I want to watch characters grow and change. I want to feel something with them. I'd love to just like watch these girls grow up and grapple with like the real world and stuff as well. I hope we get enough of that.
Yeah, I reckon I've got high hopes for this also because it's not like particularly plot driven. It's more like kind of you're looking at these moments in time and it's not like the characters developing on a more micro, like apparently micro level, even though they're obviously big for them. Like I don't see it writing itself into a plot hole. So yeah, second season. Is it coming out next year?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, cool. Rock
and roll. Well, Mel, we're on to our regular Impress Your Friends segment where we share something we watched, read, listened to, consumed in the world of culture in the past week. What have you got for me? Other than Clarkson's Farm, obviously.
I mean, everyone go watch it and then let's chat.
We can do a Clarkson's Farm episode.
Do you want to? I think we could. I think there's a lot of fun in that. A lot of weather chat. And you love weather chat.
Do I love weather chat?
I feel like you're always talking about what the weather's like.
When you live in Melbourne, it's important for your life to know what the weather's like.
Yeah, that's true. For you and the farmers. Okay, my recommendation. Look, this is an odd one and I didn't want to like this album. I thought my days of Vampire Weekend were in my past. That was an old Mel. That was high school Mel. No one needed more Vampire Weekend. But turns out I did. Only God Was Above Us is their new album. Have you listened to it?
This is one of those things where you not having Instagram leads to these really funny, awkward moments because I love this album. I went on like this kind of deranged Instagram story rant about it, about how I thought it was one of the most transcendent pieces of art in a while. And I thought how it encapsulated both Vampire Weekend's trajectory from sort of nihilistic indie rockers to becoming people who are talking about the decay of the modern world and futility of things as horrific things are happening all around us, and managing to do that in a way that felt relatable to everyone our age who grew up in that kind of pre-crisis desiring music that meant nothing, and then watching everything that we thought we would be able to live into and enjoy crumble, and then having Vampire Weekend and Ezra tell us all about it. So yes, I really like this album.
Wow.
I've got a take about it.
That was very well put. Look, this is why we get on so well. Love Vampire Weekend's new album. Yeah, I completely agree. There's like something nostalgic in the sounds, right? Because I can hear sounds of old Vampire Weekend, as well as something very new. And mainly I love, like after Kendrick and Drake with their fighting and Taylor with all her breakups, I love Vampire Weekend singing about getting old and being disillusioned in memory, and that's speaking to me right now. Love the song Capricorn. I put that on I'm making a best songs of 2024 list on Spotify, which maybe I'll share with you at the end of the year. So Capricorn and Prep School Gangsters has gone on that list for me. But yeah, I think it's a really pleasant listen.
They're my two favorites as well. And I also love Hope, which is the final track, which is like 8 minutes, because I think it's really tongue-in-cheek and people have interpreted it differently. I know some critics have said, it's nice after an album that feels a bit bleak and a bit blunt about the state of the world. The song's called Hope and you feel pretty good. I'm like, I think they're sort of taking the piss of people who have hope. It's kind of like there's nothing hopeful to enjoy. But again, a track that really makes you think, a whole album really that makes you think about things but not feel bad about it. Like the music is fun and nice whilst evoking thoughts about what is our culpability in the current moment in the state of the world in so many different ways and whether we can ever break out of it. I feel like they're kind of saying, we tried, guys. It didn't work. Just don't bother. Just like enjoy what you can. And that's certainly a really solid statement for artists to make. And what else do you want from artists other than to have a stance and articulate it in a way that sounds catchy and fun?
Yeah, agree. Have you kept up with Vampire Weekend over the years?
Yeah, I have. So Father of the Bride, which came out, I think the end of 2019 or maybe the beginning of 2020. No, it was the end of 2019. That was one of my favorite albums of that year as well. They're a really good band. And it's sort of almost a joke because they're also like the whitest band ever. And I love them. So take that.
Yeah, love it. You're complex. Okay, what's your rec?
I need to shout out my friend Alex who put me onto this show. This is the one I was watching last night instead of The Budget. She texted me about the show after listening to our conversation about the idea of you, because it stars Nicholas Galitzine. The show is called Mary and George. It's a historical drama dark comedy. It stars Julianne Moore, no less, as the Countess of Buckingham, who molds her son, played by Nicholas Galitzine, to seduce...
Wow, you are complex.
Nicholas Galitzine plays his son. She molds him into seducing King James I and becoming his lover. It's loosely based on real historical events. It's great. This is really fun. If you like The Great, which I think you did, I think you'll love this as well. It's on Binge here. It's really, really fun. And again, like, I had no idea there was like Julianne Moore and Nicholas Galitzine were in this really interesting show. It's awesome. Could not recommend this more. Mary and George.
Wow, I will give that a go. Is it the same kind of very dark, sexy tone of The Great?
I would say it's a bit less comedic and like more on the drama, but it is tonally very similar. It's like it's in the same universe as The Great. Like, let's take these things from history that traditionally have been a bit prim and proper and let's just lean into how kind of fucked up all this was. And also, King James, turns out he had a lover. Why haven't we talked about that on television before? Let's make that a show.
Wow, put that in the Reddits.
Yeah. Who was it?
All right, you bully me for a month and then I'll watch it.
Rock and roll. We'll do. Hey, Mel, I think we did a pretty good job without Thomas.
I think so. I hope he's having fun swimming with the crocodiles, whatever he's doing with them.
I hope he hasn't been eaten yet.
Yeah. Well, I imagine it would be his own fault if he was.
Mel, thanks so much. See you next week.
Bye.
This episode of The Drop was produced by Chi Wong. If you enjoyed listening to today's episode of The Drop, make sure to follow us in your favorite podcast app, leave us a review, or better yet, share it with a friend. I'm Osman Faruqi. See you next week.